Hi everyone, happy Friday Money Wind Up. I thought today we could talk about thinking a little bit outside the square. We all know it's difficult to buy a property now, and sometimes we as parents think maybe we can help the kids, maybe we can do something to help them get into a property. Well, if you've got a reasonable size piece of land, have you ever thought of putting a secondary dwelling on it? Most of them are pretty much a little granny flat, self-contained home, built on the same lot as your home. Has its own bathroom, kitchen, bedroom, living room, and it can be either attached to the main house or detached as, a separate building in the backyard. Under Queensland planning law, it's considered subordinate to the main dwelling and cannot be separately titled or sold independently. But could you rent it out? Yes, you could. Since changes to Queensland planning laws in 2022, a secondary dwelling can be rented to anyone. It no longer has to be occupied by a family member. This is a significant change aimed at increasing housing supply. But the regulations, let's look at that. There are two levels of rules, the state government rules and local council rules. The state government defines what a secondary dwelling is and how it can be occupied. However, they don't set one standardised size or the approval process. For that, you need your local council. So each council determines things such as maximum floor size, minimum lot size, setbacks from the front, height limits, parking, whether the planning approval is required, and bushfire or flood or heritage overlay requirements. So there's a lot to actually think about. This means the rules can vary significantly between councils. So to give you an idea, in Brisbane, a typical maximum size is about 80 metres squared. Rural properties, you may get away with 100. Gold Coast, again, 80 metres squared, but only 90 metres squared in rural areas. So Logan is 70 to 100 metres, and it depends on the lot size. Sunshine Coast can be 60 metres square, but larger in rural areas. Ipswich is about 50 metres squared, and they call it an auxiliary unit rather than a secondary dwelling. And in Moreton Bay, 45 to 55 metres squared. Depends on the lot size, and it is larger in rural areas. So these are general schemes, and the council can change things as they want. So always double check. But the typical requirements are there must be an existing primary dwelling on the lot. So you can't just get a tiny lot and put a tiny house on it unless there's a main dwelling there. So there may be one bigger and then put a tiny house on as well. That can be done. Second dwelling needs to be either behind or beside the main house. Can't be in front, which I think is maybe a little odd, but this is what they say. You need to be compliant with the setback requirements, and you need building approval from a certified, a private certifier. Needs to comply with all the national construction codes and the Queensland Development Code, and there needs to be adequate access and parking. Requirements vary across the different councils as well. So you say, okay, so when is development approval needed? Well, it depends on your council. Some secondary dwellings qualify as accepted development, so no planning application, if they meet all the planning scheme requirements. Others require a development application, particularly if the dwelling exceeds size limits, or the lot is too small, or there are flood or bushfire or heritage rules to be looked at. Zoning restrictions apply, so you can't put a tiny house on an industrial block, for example, or a retail block. Or you may also need it if the proposal doesn't meet the council's minimum and acceptable requirements. So what's the difference between a secondary dwelling and dual occupancy? people confuse these. So secondary dwelling is one main home and one smaller home. Dual occupancy is two independent homes. Secondary dwelling is the same lot. Dual occupancy can be the same lot or a subdivided lot. Secondary dwelling cannot be separately titled. Dual occupancy may be capable of it, depending on the planning rules, of course. And a secondary dwelling is usually simpler and cheaper, whereas a dual occupancy has more complex planning processes and potentially infrastructure changes. So if you're looking at one as an investment, many investors in Queensland build secondary dwellings because they can generate a second rental income. They can increase their overall property value, house extended for family while retaining some privacy, and they cost substantially less than buying another investment property. Biggest factors affecting feasibility are the local council's planning scheme and your property's zoning, lot size, and whether overlays, such as flooding or bushfire, apply. But it's definitely a way to think outside the square when you may want to help, whether it's your ageing parents or kids, wanting to get out in the workforce and now needing to live somewhere but can't afford to rent or buy. Give them another option. Or, alternatively, just generate another income. Have a great weekend, everyone. Happy Friday Money Wind Up.